is Mike Gill. I'm the Director of Biodiversity Indicators Program at NatureServe, and I also co-chair one of the GEO groups, which on Biodiversity Observation Networks. So I'm actually quite excited to be here. I've been watching IRIS from afar. As I understand, it's been going through testing and development phases and is ready for a full launch. So I'm really keen to learn more about how the system works and how we can, as part of my global network, contribute to it. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the session chair, which is Alex Colvis, who is responsible for big data at UN Environment and is based in Nairobi. So Alex.
Well, I'm very pleased to introduce our four speakers in this session. And I'm very much pleased because we're discussing about an indicator reporting system, but it's actually a platform to be used on the ground by countries that comes very much as a solution to a manifest need of countries in terms of their work when doing actual reporting, such as specific things of state of environment reporting, such as reporting on specific thematics. So it's one of those areas where we have a tool that comes as a solution, manifest from the needs on the ground of the countries. But let me, before I introduce, we will have first we'll start with Adele that will provide us some lessons learned from these needs and these the reporting need and how it fits, and from the experience on actually on the ground of countries and the need for capacity. Then we'll have Erick Litswa, who does not need any introduction, but I have to have a special word for Erick, because if IRIS come to this stage, definitely it was based on his leadership at the GD and the AD together with the environment to make sure that we're able to get over the problem of not only testing but making it happen to come to conclusion. Then we have Anthony from ADEC Innovations that will provide how we thinking to implement in countries, actual implementation in countries and regions to make it happen, because we know that technologies, implementation is not about technology, it's about organization, people, and funding to actually make it happen on the ground. So and finally, Erick Litswa from UN Environment will provide you where we have manifest requests from countries in projects already for the next phase, which is the deployment in countries, in regions of the IRIS platform. So that's the sketch of that. So I'll ask all of you, Adele, please, Derek to come here. Derek, Anthony, and Erick to come here to sit in the chairs, probably for the disorder. Let me have only one very important word of gratefulness for a GD and EAD, the Environmental Agency of Dhabi. We might be joined by Her Excellency, and even not being here, but it's never too much to emphasize. It was based on the vision of and leadership of a GD and EAD together with UN Environment that some years back, 3.5 years back, was able to understand it. This is one area, the reporting of information for sustainable development, but the reporting of information for environment is one area that needs our direct intervention. It's not about funding, it's about a partnership. And I have to have this word, it's based on these leaders and these visions that some have, that we are able to come to this stage. So I should underline these, because this is a proof that in order to make it happen, to have action, we need to have this kind of investment but particularly vision and leadership and persistence to make it happen. So it's a true partnership between the event environment and ED in order to make it happen. Without further ado, I will give the word to them. I have a specific question for all speakers that I hope you try to answer. We have been hearing about tools and platforms and all these, but is this going to be used? Is this of any real usefulness? Which kind of problems you anticipate on using these systems? Where in the world and why people are going to use indicator reporting systems? What is the interest that they have manifested for using? I think it's time to actually ask and to reply to these questions. Thank you for the speakers. So for this order, I think I will avoid to come to the stage, so I'll give you the floor. Please, Del.
Thank you very much, Alex, for the introduction. And thank you for IGD and UNEP for giving me the opportunity to join this specific session. I had the pleasure to work as the regional coordinator for UNEP for West Asia. So I had the hands-on experience, so working with the country on how they do their state and environmental reports and what are the needs to be able to provide really state-of-the-art report that cover the state of environment in a specific area. If we, Alex mentioned the needs. If you wanted to, make any report, so the very basic thing to do in your report is the data. If you don't have data, you will not be able to report. And countries have obligation not only to produce the state of environment for their own, mandate, but they also report to different multilateral agreements. They wanted to report to biodiversity convention. Let us first welcome Her Excellency, Mr. President. Welcome to the session. It's a pleasure to see you here, so you know the hands-on things. That's what's going on with the actual work. So what I'm saying here, countries have obligation not to only do the state of environment, but to report in many conventions and to policy forums. Like there is number of policy forums, there is number of global forums, and now we see that there is voluntary reporting on SDGs. The problem is, each one reporting work separately in silo. There is no coherence on really having a coherent database for the country that can be used for different reporting purposes. So there is a need for a tool, a platform, where everybody can find resources on data in that platform. And this platform, it doesn't has to, be centrally populated. Different agencies, you provide the platform and give access to different stakeholders who are custodian of the data and let them populate the platform. Because if you wanted to do it centrally, it becomes a little bit complicated to maintain it on the long run. Again, I go back to the issue of state of environment reporting and the needs. The first thing when you wanted to do the state of environment, you make a consultation with the stakeholder on what are the priority issues that you need to report about. Then you identify, once you know those priority issues for the country, you start to identify what are the indicators needed for each of those issues. Then what are the data that's needed to be able to develop the indicator, which really gives you the trends, what is going on, what's being done, what needs to be done. So again, if you don't have the data, you will not be able to report. And I have seen it practically that when you start doing the report, you cannot find the data digitally. if you find the data, you find it in the document. In the best case, you find the document on the internet, PDF file. And if you need a series of data for like 10 years, 20 years, whatever, you will not find one document, even PDF, that give you that series. You will find a document that gives you 2 years, another document 3 years. So you will spend a lot of time just compiling, this PDF file. And a PDF file from statistics agency or BO will probably have 200 pages or more. And you want to look through these 200 pages to find a couple of lines that has the data that you need. Then it extracts the number, plug those number in another Excel file, and you keep compiling. If you wanted a series of 20 years, you will keep compiling this series of 20 years. So what I'm trying to say, if you have a system that allow you to capture the data, organize it in a meaningful, creative way, that people can find this data, they can go online and say, okay, I want water per capita. And I want this water per capita from 2000 to 2018. Then doing that search, you will be able, it specifies the location as well. If you have like different governorate or whatever, the administrative boundary should be able to specify that, and the system should be able to give you this kind of information. And the other thing is the need is capacity building. If we don't do capacity building on how people collect the data, how to use the system, how to populate the system, how to analyze the data, how to translate the data into presentable information that can be used and consumed by the decision maker, then we're still not doing the proper thing. So capacity building is key to anything. Countries, unfortunately, sometimes, I have to say, we are for this specific areas, for a specific, in the past it was developed, but it wasn't mature enough to be ready to kind of market it to the audience. But now, I think we are in a different stage, because if you wanted to have a tool, you need this tool to be tested and well working, and when you raise expectation for the countries, then you can implement it. You need to have an implementation plan, so when you go to a country, you have a plan, okay, we have a system, the system is well tested, and it is working, and we want to work with you to help you to collect your data, organize it in a meaningful and useful way. Then with the plan, you have timeline, steps, and what is every step, what is needed to implement. I can go on and on, but I know we have other speakers, so I don't want to take more of your time. And at the end of the session, if there is a question, I will be more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you today about the IMS project, and great pleasure to follow from Dr. Adel, and I want to give my personal gratitude to Dr. Adel. This project has its genesis, it goes back a long way, and it's very much informed by his wisdom and knowledge acquired over many years in the region and first-hand experience of many of the challenges, but also his thought leadership in the solutions that we can implement. So it's been my privilege to take this project and to bring it to where it is today. But this gentleman, the genesis of it, I think, is substantially informed by Dr. Adel. So IRIS is the Indicator Reporting Information System. I'm happy to report that I'm not only an event organizer, I actually have a day job. So this is my day job. So in a nutshell, what is IRIS? IRIS is an enterprise, I'm reading to you, and it's an enterprise web server application.
It's a software product, but it's available as a local intranet installation or as a hosted service. And the idea is it automates the production of routine reports. Many organizations are required to report on against, we've heard Maria was talking on the conventions and national performance on reporting. It's a burden on many organizations, and the further down the geographic hierarchy you go, and you go towards smaller, subnational, even the organizations in much of the world have very limited resources in terms of manpower, scientific expertise, IT infrastructure, and yet my contention is that much of the data in the environment that is the measurements that are made in the field are made at that bottom tier, the lowest tier, not in terms of governance terms, the lower tier, and it works its way up through from subnational to national, national to regional, regional to global governance processes. So when our friends at UN Environment try to produce a global Earth outlook, they're reliant upon data that's filtering its way up through this hierarchy, but it can be very slow. And under conventional methods, and you wait for state of environment reports to be produced, and these can take years to produce, and then they have to be aggregated. By the time you get to a global information product, it can be frankly close to being out of date. So we need to speed up the process. IRIS, the intention is that it will be an open source software product, so it will be available for others to use. But also, it will that open source strategy will allow the users the assurance that the product is fit for purpose, because they and the community can audit the code and can check that it's fit for purpose. And it's very much a targeted response to real-world challenges. In a moment, I'm going to very briefly explain what the GD initiative is about. But this project is informed and arises from real-world needs. And this is what I was referencing to Dr. Adal's experience over many years in this region and some of the very specific challenges that organizations face. It's designed to provide a real business benefit. We've approached this from the perspective of ensuring that IRIS delivers a real return on investment. And it very much supports institutional capacity building. We know that that's a major challenge. It's the core message of the World Data Forum. And the way I will come to it in detail later, but the way IRIS works as a capacity building tool is, as well as being a workhorse system that delivers information products, the processes, the business processes that are embedded in the IRIS workflow can be shared online for other IRIS users. So if you have to design a reporting template against which reports are produced, if you have to define integrated algorithms, if you have to define data sources, that only needs to be done once and is uploaded to what we call a shared knowledge base, and then can be downloaded and deployed as a configuration by another IRIS installation. So we have this global community of IRIS. We can envisage a global community of IRIS users who are collaborating and sharing knowledge and redeploying knowledge. And that's going to be, we believe, particularly relevant in the subnational tier of governance, where institutional capacity is often limited, and yet we can find there will be some organizations or some communities can define, for example, an algorithm for a particular geographic context or climatic regime, share it online, and then other users can just simply import it. It becomes part of their IRIS configuration, and they're ready to go. So just briefly, I need to explain to you a little bit about the Abu Dhabi Global Environmental Data Initiative. It's an initiative conceived here in the UAE in 2002, launched at the World Summit for Sustainable Development. And it's, as it says in yellow there, a global initiative to facilitate the access to quality environmental data that equips policymakers with actionable, timely information to inform and guide critical decisions towards a sustainable future. Now, that message is quite important, because that's what we're hearing coming out of the World Data Forum 1, the Cape Town Global Action Plan, reinforced this week. But Abu Dhabi, in 2002, at the launch of the Millennium Development Goals, recognized the need to act on the issue of data and indicators, and took a thought and action leadership position by defining a global initiative that would serve the needs of Abu Dhabi, but in a very magnanimous gesture, to scale out and to replicate and to share that knowledge with the rest of the world, in recognition that it didn't matter what any one regime or one governance does, if sustainability has to be achieved on a global basis. So we have to share the knowledge. So that's the basis of AGIDI, and the AGIDI, the initiative is implemented through a partnership between the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi, that goes back to 2002, in partnership with the UN Environment. And this project is a great example of AGIDI in action. It's I would consider it a Global South initiative. Focuses on that. So, just the basic context. This is obvious, and perhaps it doesn't need to be said at this level of a meeting. But we know sustainable development is about, the top little cartoon shows, we have three competing tensions, three dimensions of sustainability, three principal dimensions: economic, social, and environment. And they're in tension. And at any point in time, the nexus, that knot of where those three ropes falls, it's a moving feast, and it's a question of where you want it to be, and it's a question of which of the competing forces, who's pulling strongest, which one do you want to pull strongest? Where do you want? I mean, there's where you want the knot to be, where you are, and how are you going to shift from one place to the other. And that's the challenge that the executive decision makers, the leadership, have to take. The competing forces. The bottom diagram is I think is a nice way to show it. We're familiar with the old-fashioned 2-cup scales for evaluating two things. Well, now with the sustainable development, we have 3 cups: social, environment, and economic. And we have to decide, how are we going to get the balance? What is the optimum balance? And what trade-offs are we prepared to make? So in order to do that, we need information, and we need actionable information. And we don't need information on a particular topic area in isolation. We need to understand the relationship, the causal and impact relationships, so we can see the state of the environment, any particular aspect of the environment. We need to know what are the drivers of change, what causes the environment state to change, and what are the consequences of those change on social well-being. And we need, and so the decision maker who's trying to balance the 3 cups here needs to have information on all 3 of those elements and the connectivity between them, so they can do the rope pulling at the top to position the knot at the best, at the optimum place at a point in time. So IRIS is indicator based, and I think everyone in the room is very clear what that means, but I think this is a good illustration of the body temperature. Something we all understand, it's clear, and it encapsulates a great deal of information. It tells us about the state of health of our body. So IRIS is working on such a system. It's the number that we're looking at is meaningful, actionable. The origin of the number, what makes the number that it is it can be a complex set of processes and variables. IRIS is based on, is an algorithmic approach, so it is based on quantitative data, and that I believe is necessary for objectivity and repeatability. So it's an algorithm approach to calculating indicators. And then the idea is that we can create, as I've kind of explained, a dashboard. A dashboard is one form of reporting, and I've shown it there. Those of you in the environmental sector will be familiar with the DPSIR concept of a flow of cause and effect. So there may be economic stimuli or drivers of, for example, industrialization, which is great, and it creates jobs. Those jobs may involve manufacturing, which may result in emissions. The emissions can cause a deleterious effect on the state of the environment. That can have an adverse effect on the health, and we respond to that through various policy mechanisms. So to have the integrated decision making that leadership needs, we need a dashboard, and we need the data and the indicators behind the whole workflow, so we can see on balance how are we doing between the competing forces of that knot diagram. The basic data workflow is very simple. Folks ultimately go out into the environment one way or another, directly, indirectly, through instrumentation, through remote sensing, through in situ measurements, and they build a monitoring database of records, of measurements. We then go through a process of converting those measurements data into information, actionable information that decision makers can act upon, and then they are sent onwards to a recipient who's interested to receive this information and act on it. And it goes and it ends up in a report often, and the report will go into some form of report repository. Now, that's all very well within an organization, but what typically happens is, if I can use the mouse here. So the data is being collected here and going into a database, and there will be other data sets. So when we do a state of environment report, of course, we need to access data on population and various other non-environmental parameters to inform the process. So we have data coming in from the environment, data coming in from other sectors for the DPSIR approach, and we produce the output is a report. And that report will go on typically, this pyramid represents the tiers of governance. So subnational at the bottom, national, regional, and global at the top. So what I'm showing here is there's a flow of information and an aggregation of information from subnational through national, regional, and global. And we're integrating data and processing data and converting it into actual information as we rise. The story here, as you see, there's a lot of red documents flying around here. And we're back to Adele's point earlier, that historically we had a lot of PDFs flying around, and it's all very well, but it's not really very actionable. So that's the context in which we exist today. So what are some of the challenges that exist in the real world organizations? Well, we have sectoral data holdings. We're all familiar. We try to move on from data silos, but it's a hard thing to move away from. And then within each sector, we have a workflow of data management, processing the data, analysis and commentary on the data, bringing the scientific expertise to bear, and then doing the presentations. So we saw the excellent work of Jim Toomey earlier, where you're communicating this information in an effective way. So that's the workflow within each sector, and it's in most contexts it's each sector is doing that thing in isolation, and the poor fellow at the end here who's got to make a decision is overwhelmed with all this information. Too much information, but what do I do with it? That's the situation. So there's a list of issues here that we're dealing with: data silos, knowledge silos. There is it's very difficult to move away from the fact that, okay, I collected the data, I'm the subject matter expert. I'm not happy to share this data with someone else because they don't understand the nuance of the context in which the data exists and they may misinterpret. So, and this is a long known barrier to information sharing. Many issues there: scientific and data literacy of policymakers and civil society. The challenge is for this fellow at the end. I mean, this is a very difficult job. No one can be a data expert and a subject matter expert on all things that flow in. They need actionable advice, concise, succinct, scientifically robust, but digestible. So these are all the problems that we're facing. So we went into IRIS with this design brief to create an indicator-based reporting tool. So it's indicator-based, it's not subjective, it's very objective, very logical, mathematical in some respects. We want to enable integrated multi-indicator environmental assessments, but to be aware of or to include social and economic drivers and consequences, to provide a capability, a reporting capability for organizations that have very little capacity. Often, in much of the world, particularly at the subnational level, in many developing countries, the environment team is a single handful of people and a few laptops. We want it to be relevant to all scales of government, so it has to be from subnational all the way up to global. We want to enable formal inter-organizational reporting. We're reporting for a purpose, we hope. Someone out there actually wants this information, and we are responding to a need rather than hopefully not being too pushing information on people who don't know what to do with it. The system has to support all data and information sharing policies. We have to be in the real world. There are reasons why, in certain contexts, there is a reluctance to share, and if we're in a conservative context, then we have to handle that. We push and advocate for open data policies, but there are times when it's not possible. So that's the reality we have to deal with. We want to support tactical reporting. We want to be relevant around the world. Now that's important because it means that the information system cannot be linked to any particular indicator suite or any particular geography. It has to be agnostic on these things. So we have to externalize the knowledge and configure the system. So we have an IRIS toolkit which is then configured to a particular indicator and reporting suite. It has to be durable. There are too many information products that are built by people who are really interested in the product and the development of the product, and 2 years later it's kind of died a death. It wasn't sustainable, so we don't want to be in that space. And we have to deliver business benefit. This has actually got to deliver the needs of an organization. And as I've said, we want IRIS to act as a capacity building tool. So now I just want to explain where the boundaries of IRIS are, because IRIS is part of an ecosystem of data and tools. IRIS is the middle part there. It depends upon data being collected and held and organized in a central in a proper managed repository. But that is outside the scope of IRIS. IRIS is not a data, is not an observational data management tool. That needs to be done as part of an ecosystem. And IRIS produces output products which need to be held in an organized repository. That is after IRIS. So IRIS is the tool in the middle, but it has all these other components have to be put in place. So there needs to be capacity building around the tool. Okay. And it has to be like that if you think about it. It would be impossible to be other. Now I'm going to skip some of the technical things because this is a bit too much detail for what we're doing. This diagram is an extension of the one you saw before, and this represents the hierarchy of reporting. We have data coming in at the left, being value added, turned into useful information, and sent on to someone who hopefully wants it. That person then takes the organization, and if this then goes to the next tier of governance, they receive that information, as do others. So for example, a subnational entity will be reporting to a federal entity. The federal entity will be receiving reports from many of the subnational units, and then aggregating it into a national report. And that process repeats up and up and up and up. So we then have the concept of IRIS reports acting as a data transfer vehicle. So we're not just submitting reports. The idea with IRIS is that an IRIS report, you can see in the diagram, the little red book, but attached to it, if you will, this is obviously all digital. We have the data behind the report. So what we're doing is we're overcoming this resistance to sharing information because we're sharing the data in the context of the narrative. So we are providing a report that's based on indicators. We have the narrative around why the indicator value is as it is and what is the trend and what does that trend mean, but also we're providing the data behind it to substantiate it. And then we send it onward. So then we can go from a subnational IRIS to a national IRIS. The national IRIS receives the reports, and these are machine readable reports, including the data, and from that can be produced automatically, very, very rapidly, a national report. The only human intervention in that step of converting the data to the report, once it's configured, is the subject matter expert adding the narrative, the explanatory narrative. The rest of it is automated for purposes of speed and to get the data through. So that leads us to this scenario where we can envisage across the tiers of governance IRIS systems deployed and communicating and sharing information between each other via report. The report, so a report is produced by a system, is produced for the stakeholder, and they receive their report, but it's more than that. The report then becomes a data conveyance vehicle and can very rapidly be processed by the higher tier of governance to produce a national report. They do their value adding, it goes on and so on. So the idea is that national, regional and global reports can be produced very, very rapidly and in a timely fashion, and the information be actionable and useful. This one we can go past because that's historical. And then, so IRIS has a role, a significant role as a capacity building tool, because as I was explained, it's part of an ecosystem. So IRIS, its implementation and deployment focuses organizational activity around reporting obligations. So we're needs driven. IRIS encourages what are we doing and why are we doing it, what information do we need, and what data do we need to collect, because you're starting from the end point. You're saying what do we actually need, and you're working back to therefore what do we need to collect, rather than the converse, which is what often happens. People go and collect what they think is interesting or useful and then report it, but it doesn't necessarily match to what the recipient needs. The executive dashboard feature reveals the state of organizational monitoring. Now, this sounds a little bit kind of Machiavellian, but there is value in presenting to the executive the dashboard, including those gauges, where some of them are going to be grayed out. And you don't have a DPSIR. You can't see a full cause-effect relationship because the data stream isn't there. Well, that will then focus attention. Okay, well, I need to have this information. We have to make some intervention here, and I can't report on so and so. Why not? Well, let's drill into and find out what data stream or what knowledge is missing, so it can facilitate and focus institutional resources on doing the right thing. I've explained that it focuses on the DPSIR framework. It focuses the attention on the collection of the correct data and the storing of the data in a proper structured fashion. These are the prerequisites. So the value proposition of IRIS is substantial, but in order to deliver that, you have to get your act together as an institution and make sure that you are collecting the right data. So it's a way of basically framing the whole data to information debate and pushing the issue through. So we'll move on quickly. So I'm going to finish, I think, my part of the presentation at this stage, just to summarize what some of the features and benefits are. There's a half-day presentation on the way IRIS works. But the key thing is that with IRIS, there is a body of work to be done at the outset when you first are creating a new report. You have to decide what report why am I making this report? Who is it for? You start from the end point. So what is the purpose of this? What do they need to know? Then you work back to, okay, and therefore, how is it going to be displayed? And what information is going to be, do I need to have that? And therefore, what data collection regime do I need? IRIS produces reports in a timely fashion. It reduces institutional burden by automating the process and sharing, and through the shared knowledge base allows information to be, or the knowledge to be shared and redeployed. It develops institutional capacity, overcomes the issue with data sharing, and provides a mechanism to expedite the exchange of an aggregation of data between tiers. So that's what the IRIS system is. There's a vast presentation to be given on the details, but I think at that point we can hand on to hear about how UNEP are the GD partners. So we've got to a point of working together, identifying a solution that exists or an issue that exists in our local context, specifying a solution, developing a solution, which is what we've done, EAD and UN Environment have done through the GD partnership, and now UNEP, or UN Environment, as a member of the partnership, now take that product and deploy it nationally, regionally, and globally. And the two colleagues who are going to follow me are very much involved in that. Eric is involved in is the IRIS deployment manager at UN Environment, and the gentleman is from ADEC, who is supporting UN Environment in the capacity building and the deployment beyond the region. So that's what IRIS is.
I'm Anthony Catajan. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer of ADIC Innovation. So just to give you a bit of a background, ADIC Innovation started as a business process outsourcing. So meaning for years that we're doing business, our people are doing process mapping, converting paper into digital information. So one of the challenge, or a few of the challenges that we encounter in handling big data is finding the data, cleaning the data or processing the data, and giving visibility to the data. And I guess these are few of the things or few of the value that we can bring in to assist UNEP in their implementation of IRIS in the member states and to the different stakeholders. So ADIC Innovation will ensure that the participating country or organization would be able to smoothly transition IRIS by putting in people on the ground, by doing mapping the current processes, including data gathering, verification, conversion, and uploading. We provide process improvement. So we have people that works with the stakeholders to understand their pain points, to understand their challenges, and be able to come up with a proposed suggestions or improvement that could help the implementation more smoothly. We are proposing the setup for the IT infrastructure, given our subject matter expert on the ground as well, providing training, assessment, and evaluation. The organization always believes that in implementing something, especially if this is something new, carrot and stick doesn't work well. We have to add education. We have to create value. We have to make them understand the value of what they're doing for us to be able to get their support. We also provide the help desk support on technical queries on large-scale IRIS implementation, and getting and addressing feedback from the users and providing post-training support. So ADEC Innovation will deploy and send to an interested country an implementation team experienced with data management. So from mapping, analysis, collaboration, and documentation, these are the tasks that our folks will be doing on the ground, working with the different stakeholders. Our aim is to ensure a smooth transition from the current reporting processes to an automated reporting processes using IRIS. Working with the group of Eric and Alex, we were able to identify the different steps that we need to go through to be able to successfully implement IRIS on the ground. From need assessment from the country or entity with UNEP, for UNEP identifying the key assets and summary, ADEC will be able to roll out the activities, identify the timelines, capacity building and training, resource allocation, technical implementation including support and maintenance. Then UNEP will do the monitoring and evaluation. ADEC, in compliance with the different international standard, gives importance to information security. Most of our activities conforms with a certain information protocol, one of which is ISO 27001, which is the Information Security Management System. And working with other institutions also globally, we have to be compliant with other security protocol like PCI DSS, and especially if we're working for a bank. So this is how we structure also our support to make sure that we will be observing the governance structure while we are helping UNEP in this implementation. So these are how UNEP and ADEC will going to approach the member states, especially those member states that are really interested in deploying IRIS in their country. So from need assessment, again, from data sharing to pre-deployment technical discussion. So this will all be covered by UNEP. So the implementation process will be vetted by UNEP, and of course, if there are countries that are interested to have IRIS, then they can also express their interest with UNEP. Then that's the only time that it will go down to us to assist in the implementation. So this is how we see the global mapping diagram. And if you will notice, there are different standards or protocols that are listed below that will support the shared knowledge base. So depending on the information that the client or the stakeholders would have, this will all be considered. Remember that IRIS is a tool. It allows the member states or enable them to build, not only to build their capacity, but have this leeway to provide information that suits their current situation. So the data flow diagram that we have identified as well, from creating the indicators, which you have the different thematic areas, by publishing the information, coming up with a full report that would meet the requirement of UNEP, that will meet the requirement of GD, and of course the member states. So we are showing our capability diagram working with UNEP through IRIS. So from acquisition, retrieving data from the country, our people will work with the different stakeholders and UNEP, loading the data, making the analysis. Well, IRIS will prepare the parameters, and on our end, we'll do the data analysis, processing, which calculate the indicator values, while we are web scraping, manual scraping, data preparation, meaning cleaning the data, through final reporting. We are confident that we should be able to implement this activity in a month or 4 weeks. But of course, this is dependent on the availability of information, and of course what are the different things that we need to do to be able to clean the information so that it will become more useful to the users. We have also identified, working with UNEP, the timeline or activities per phase from week 1 to week 4, and what are the different outputs that we are expecting from week 1 to week 4. ADEC Innovations will leverage its own data as a service solutions and staffing in building capacity, in customizing in-country or project-based implementation of IRIS. As an illustration below, a comparison of IRIS and ADEC Innovations data as a service to exemplify our capability to handle data, dashboard and reporting mechanism for IRIS. So with data, dashboard, and reports, we should be able to deliver the requirement of a GD and UNEP. As I mentioned earlier, we need education to be built into the process. So we have user's guide, we have web application help, we have video snippets, and helping them on the ground. So ADEC Innovations, in the process of implementing IRIS, will also cover educating the end user. We will have a generic approach, possibly, of course, with UNEP is doing an in-person training during the country visit and mission. So we'll be working with them in doing this on the ground. ADEC will be conducting training tailored to the country's implementation. During the training, we will use the outcome of the activities performed in implementing IRIS. So as we go on, we will gather all of this information, and as we improve the different training modules that we're going to share with the member states. So this is what we propose as an initial ADEC implementation team structure. But of course, as we go on, we are willing to provide more resources to be able to meet the requirement on the ground implementation. So we'll start with the project manager. We have the data analyst. We have process analyst. We have release and configuration specialist, and of course, the trainer or SME in IRIS tool. So we're looking at the implementation into 2 areas, either internet-based, or this is a cloud-based, or if there are some limitation in this infrastructure, we can do it internet or on-premise. So interested countries can engage UNEP to implement IRIS on an internet solution or as an intranet solution. The decision between this option depends on the technical readiness, staff resources, and of course, institutional data policies. So ADEC will also provide technical support through voice, by email, and email by chat. So ADEC recognizes the value of improving the overall experience of IRIS users. So having a support team in place ensures seamless and effective fulfillment of deliverables. And this will be done in 24/7, just like the 24/7 help desk. So with all of this information will be put into a database to gather as much as data that we need to be able to improve more the implementation of IRIS on the ground. And this information will create eventually a community of practice wherein we get inputs from the different stakeholders on how we're going to improve and smoothen the operations on the ground and be able to get more participation among the member states. So to summarize things, ADEC is here to be able to support IRIS implementation by providing people on the ground that will work with on the grassroots and be able to understand what are the things that we really need to address to be able to make these things more successful. We can always do it through the WebEx or through the web or internet, but based on our experience working with the stakeholders directly would help and make it more and increase the possibility of a success if we're doing it correctly. Thank you for your attention.
So during my presentation, I'll only show you 3 slides. One slide, and then I'll also show you, the 3 slides is basically 2 links and 1 slide which I'll be able to talk about. So as the technology is getting on, we would like to just ground everything you've had in reality. Because so far, and the website, we'll start with this one, yeah. So let's ground everything into reality, because you've heard from the journey how it started. There was a conference, or at least a workshop in the West Asia region, where there was a clearly identified need. And the idea was that there must be a tool, or at least tools, that allow for indicator reporting in some shape or form. But of course, at the time, it was just an aspiration. This is the workshop that was mentioned. And then picking up on that, UNEP and Environment Agency Abu Dhabi then partnered, or at least there was the partnership of AJEDI, and one of the fruits, or at least outcomes of this partnership, was what we're now calling IRIS. Others call it IRIS, but it's IRIS. But anyway, acronyms don't really matter here. It's Indicator Reporting Information Systems. You've also seen a little bit about if all countries were to look for this particular tool, how would UN Environment be able to respond to this kind of request? And yet, UN Environment is not a software house. I mean, you really have to partner with business, and we really appreciate the partnership with ADEC Innovations, an American company. Now, let's now look at the 2 links first, and then I'll be able to talk about a diagram. So this is the first link, and you can see this is how IRIS can be completely configured in such a way that people who've seen IRIS in the past may not even be aware that this is IRIS running in the background. Now, in this particular example, we have all the 54 pan-European countries who have picked on IRIS as a tool that they are using to manage how indicators are reported to the state of the reporting of the indicators themselves. So the system itself is such that the content or the data is not about the actual data that is from the monitoring situation. No. The European Union have specific parameters that they've identified, and they want to track to what extent all the member states, in fact, not just member states, but all the 54 pan-European countries are collecting and gathering and reporting and making sure that they are on track in making sure that all these indicators are moving forward for all the countries. So in this particular solution, if you look at the URL even, environmentlive/says default, you log in, and to get in, you'll find a very interesting business model for this particular example, the Shared Environmental Information System. This is a tool that they also discuss during the Regional Economic Commissions for Europe, the UNECE, when they're discussing to what extent the member states have contributed to certain developments with regard to indicator development and how far they have reached. Very rich. But you see, we can't even get in because IRIS, the country, the project, the region may decide to internalize it. So yes, you've provided the tool, but that's it. If they choose to share, then we will be able to see something on the internet with a URL that the country, the project may decide. Another example. This is an example from Cameroon. Earlier this month, we went to Cameroon. Cameroon came to us and mentioned that you need to be with us for a minimum of 11 days. We want to see exactly how to implement IRIS. So first, we want to actually see how are you actually installing this tool? Because we have identified 3 institutions: the Environment Ministry, the Statistics Office, and one other agency. And they wanted to see how we are doing it at the Environment Agency, and then they were to deploy 4 other instances themselves based on the capacity that has been acquired based on the 11-day training. So it started from installation all the way to configuring an indicator, pointing it to a monitoring network, up until you have an IRIS report. What Derek was mentioning, these numbers that have context. Now, in that sense, the use case was such that the country then decided 11 days is what we think we need for a pilot implementation of IRIS. Now, let me now go back to the slide. It's just one slide, actually. Now, from the diagram, now you can see why there's a lot of blue in Europe, because of this particular example that I mentioned, the Shared Environmental Information System. What are we looking at here? We are looking at countries, projects around the world who right now are interested in IRIS. And if you look through some of the figures here, you'll find some red markings, or at least some red explanations. Those are like countries that are already implementing in a pilot way IRIS. I've mentioned Cameroon. Maybe I'll also give you the example of Bosnia. Bosnia were with us, or rather, maybe before I go to Bosnia, I'd like to just make something clear. From the time we had the workshop in West Asia, that was a bit early. It was still premature. We didn't have a tool ready. And then in 2015, UN Environment conducted a country visits to 20 countries around the world. I participated in some of them. Some of you may know of Jackie McGlade. We went with her directly to Tehran. That was the very first location where we went to just ask and see from the on the ground if there is any interest in IRIS. At the time, the visits were very, very brief. 2 days, 3 at most. To Tehran, we flew the whole night at 3 in the morning. We arrive, we check into the hotel at 8, we're in this session until 5. We come back the next day at lunchtime, we check out, airport and home. I mean, if you knew about Jackie, this is how she used to do her work. Very, very precise. But after that, we got to a point where 20 countries were identified, some in Africa, even in the some of the European countries as well, the 5 stans, the Kazakhstans and this kind of countries were identified. And clearly it was an effort to help us to see if this concept is not just a West Asia concept, but it has a global audience. And therefore, this partnership then with Ajedi has allowed us to have a tool which then got deployed, or at least released in December of last year. That's when we had UNEA 3. That's when the first, you could say, the ready version 1 of IRIS came out, ready for the market. And at that point, when it came out, because it was like UNEA was going on, and the first country that actually implemented it was Montenegro. Now, Montenegro had a very interesting requirement. Now, government-related data cannot be shared. You cannot put it on the cloud. Remember, like Derek mentioned, that IRIS can be deployed in 2 formats. You can either put it as an intranet solution or put it on the cloud. This was also touched on by Adek colleague. Now, for Montenegro, it was clear that you cannot put anything on the web, on the cloud server. So you have to physically be present on their server to install IRIS. And of course, this now helps you to see that IRIS, the deployment is very different. Sometimes, yes, we may think it would be better to have things on the cloud, but depending on whatever it is, you can't just assume that that is the model. So why are Montenegro implementing IRIS? for the simple reason that they, as Montenegro, would like to report to the European Union on all these indicators, and they want to start doing it from 2019. So they had looked through all the tools and identified IRIS. It's interesting how they identified IRIS. If you spend some time and look at the Montenegro example of how they decided to go about implementing the SDGs, they first decided to write everything out, a strategy on implementation of SDGs at the national level. They produce a document in their language and then an English copy that is about 800 pages. Therein, you find IRIS embedded as the solution to implement the strategy for NSD, or rather in this case, the SDGs for Montenegro. I mean, that's quite remarkable, even for us. That's a very high expectation on IRIS. So of course, they mentioned to us that if we find that it's not working out, then we may change a little bit of this expectation from within IRIS. Huh? But clearly, that was the very first real deployment of IRIS. Now, of course, I've mentioned about Montenegro. We also have Bosnia and Herzegovina, who tried our IRIS even before this release for December. Right now, at least from the kind of feedback that we are getting, we have, it looks like we are now going more and more towards two ways of deploying IRIS. One, we have member states who make specific requests to UN Environment that we need this capacity to have an indicator reporting information system. Another way in which the deployment is taking place is through projects, like the project for SAIS, the Shared Environmental Information System. You can see like countries like China, India, these are an ongoing project that we are implementing right now on monitoring the illegal killing of elephants. Now, this particular project, the MIKE project, monitoring of illegal killing of elephants, we are using IRIS for that. That's why you find all the elephant range states covered in this particular diagram. And then, of course, why is Latin America covered? Among the Latin American countries, 33 of them actually in total, they have a regional need. They want to have an indicator reporting framework where they've already mapped out what it is that the LAC countries would like to have. And they see IRIS as one way in which they can go about it. So you can see even from my balance or discussion, or at least speech, that it's still in negotiations. Yeah. Then another active project that is also bringing out a few other deployments is what we're calling the Shared Environmental Information System. It's a European funded project, but for certain countries in Africa and Asia Pacific. So within like the next 6 months, you'll find, especially in this project, we need to schedule deployment to Mauritius, starting with Mauritius, and then moving on to Malawi, and then to Zambia in that order. Clearly, if we look at the situation of UN Environment, and I think it was mentioned, there's only 1 or 2 or 3, at most 5 in the team. Huh? 1 deployment manager, 2 programmers, very small team. I mean, we would not have managed to be able to pull it off, in as much as it's a need from the member states. And therefore, UN Environment welcomes this opportunity, especially partnering with business to be able to help us even with this kind of ambitions. Because of course, the diagram itself shows you clearly that IRIS is no longer a question of the West Asian need, but it has now attracted a global audience. And we are happy at this point. I just started this role, by the way, March last year, so it's just a year and a half going. And I'm glad to at least have been involved in these early stages of IRIS deployment. Thank you for giving me your attention. Of course, as it was mentioned, we all look forward to some questions at least thrown at us, and hopefully we'll answer some of them. Thanks.
I have to thank all the presenters. Let me take this opportunity to reinstate having the presence of Her Excellency Ms. Zan. At the very beginning, we reinstated the fact that IRIS is today a reality because of the vision and leadership of GD and EAD in partnership with the UN environment to make sure this happens. I will kick off the discussion asking very specific questions to our presenters because I think it's very important. To our partner colleague from business, the question is in your honest, rigorous opinion, as looking at as a tool, software, is it ready to the next step? Is it ready to be used? Is it ready to be deployed? Because we have seen you presented a nice architecture for implementing. If you were to buy the tool, would you buy it? If you can respond very precisely to this question, because it's this kind of assessment that we need to move next to the next stage. That's a question for you. I have a question for Erick. We have seen some pilots and demonstration projects. A pilot in Europe, a demonstration in Montenegro, with the IRIS. The needs, it's for sure needed a stronger plan to have a deployment strategy to go on. So the next step will require a strategy and implementation plan. From what you have seen, what's the worst difficulty in implementing IRIS in your country? Okay, it's a specific question. For Derek, is more directly, is a GD and the AD has taken the lead and made possible the existence of the platform. The next step, for sure, is the implementation in West Asia as a first region, but then to scale up to other countries. So what is, from your perspective, is immediate implementation for West Asia on the tool and for the countries, and at least summary, and then scaling up for worldwide. And finally for Adele, but it was the first, does this correspond to realizing what you had in mind and what you heard at the beginning in terms of needs of the countries, or not? Is it going in the right way, or would you kill it and forget about it? So 4 precise questions, and then I hand over to the if you can answer those very summary answers.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for that question. Very interesting. Well, just to give you a brief response on that, I've been looking at AV since you may know. I've seen the presentation when we were there at the Big Data Forum, and sitting with some of the stakeholders during that event. I can see the value of IRIS. In fact, if you're asking me if I'm going to buy it right now, I will. With of course data. On the other hand, with the years of doing this platform, there are huge intellectual content already. And in fact, this is something that's really interests us in assisting UNEP, because we know that we can even add more value so that it can create more interest to the other member states. And working with the people on the ground would help us do this, and would help us create this value. I firmly believe that if we will be able to do it correctly, we should be able to do it with 193 member states. And with this information, we hope as a company that it will create difference in how member states are looking at sustainable or environmental information to make their policies and operations more sustainable. So that's how I'm looking at it. Thank you.
Regarding the
question on what problems are encountered. I mean, in deployment of early deployment of IRIS. I would say that there are quite a number of very interesting and sometimes even bizarre problems. For instance, we really cannot re-emphasize the need to have language embedded in the discussions. For instance, you may start a workshop, say like the way we started the workshop in Cameroon, installing and deploying IRIS in English. When a Q&A session starts, the discussion slowly but definitely moves towards French. And if you don't understand French, then you probably would not be able to interact at all or carefully with the real data users who are on the ground. Language is a very key component of these elements. It's a challenge. So the team, at least in as much as the user interface can be put into French, but the discussions, or at least the content, language is a factor. And some discussions, you don't just get out the flavors if you've not considered language. You can't assume that it's just English that will be used for the delivery of IRIS. Now, IRIS, so far from what we've seen again, everyone, there's no standard way in which you can say IRIS is being used. So, for instance, in Cameroon, they have an ambition over the next 2 years to be able to develop their first ever State of the Environment report. That's very, very precise, and that's exactly what they want. Indicators that the management of these indicators that they are going to use for the their first ever State of the Environment report, and after that to have every 2 years, and this is now in their legislation, to be able to do it. Now, in this case, IRIS is being used, I guess, to guide also the assessment so that the State of the Environment report can be used. I mean, that's a unique use case. But in another example, for instance, like Mauritius, they already have a system, or at least a monitoring network for the implementation of, I mean, they collect data regularly. Mauritius is way ahead in terms of collection of data. But they're now using IRIS, or at least they like to use IRIS, to produce what they call a digest. The international community in 2015 has identified the need to standardize environmental statistics in a framework we call FDES, the Framework for Development of Environmental Statistics. So they'd like to see all these indicators in their system mapped carefully into FDES, and then IRIS doing this automatic generation of the digest, which is a publication that in Mauritius comes annually. So clearly, a completely different use case for IRIS. Of course, I mentioned about Montenegro. So all I'm saying is that you cannot assume that IRIS will be used like that or like this. In as much as we say, okay, for instance, also 2 other examples were like the monitoring of the illegal killing of elephants. I mean, we didn't think of IRIS being applied in that context, or even for the pan-European colleagues, using it for the monitoring of how the countries are responding to the indicator performance, the performance of indicators for all the 54 pan-European countries. So these are just some of the things that I've seen right now. But of course, we all have to, I mean, it's clear even in the workshops and the conference that data collection, I mean, that's still a big, big challenge. Also, of course, the methodologies. In the workshop, somebody would even mention, how then do we actually calculate this indicator? And they may throw an indicator that you have absolutely no idea what to do. I mean, oxygen in water. It sounds very easy, but how do you do it? You know, it's not a discussion for IRIS. That's a discussion in another forum, discussing about methodologies. So clearly, there are a couple of challenges that are being documented as well, and also in any of the sessions we have frequently asked questions, which we are also documenting, which will help or inform future deployments of ARIS?
Let me split my answer in two parts. One part is to really answer directly, is the specific tool that were developed is meeting the needs or requirement of the countries. Let me say, at the time when we thought about this tool, I would say, as long as the tool is providing a way to organize the data, to capture the data, and manage the data, and be able to look at trends from this data, then it is answered. That's for sure. But let us say it is an evolving process. The needs is not static. What we need some years ago is not necessarily what's needed now, and it's not necessarily what's needed in the future. So the system needs to be dynamic, respond to the evolving needs. For example, if we, back then we didn't have the SDGs. Now we have the SDGs. So with the SDGs, things gets a little bit more complicated because you got more institutions involved, you got social data, and you got economic data, and you got environmental data, and there is more stakeholder involved in the future. I think also using the system will help to develop the system better, because some features, the user will know that they need more features than existing or not. This only comes with really the use and the price. So this is the first part of my answer. The second part of my answer is the bigger vision of the system. Because when really we thought about this, we were thinking of a full integrated reporting system, not only a module to handle the data side of reporting. So we said, okay, we have one module, look at the data, capturing the data, managing the data, and then find ways to analyze the data. But in reporting, you need to report, to have a policy section, you need to have a scenario section, you need to have the option or policy option section, and you need to have a data bank or a bank on success stories and best practices. Things when you write a report, you need to have those elements. And one of the most difficult things when we write a report is to really get examples of good success stories to tell people, because when you report, you should not focus on everything is negative. That is usually I would say the wrong thing that a lot of people, the mistake they fall in. We make the report only talk about all the negative. Environment is not good, air is not good, water is not good, food is not good. So this is not the reporting. The reporting is saying we have a problem in water, and this is water quality is a problem. And we have a problem in air, but there is really effort being done. There is policies that's addressing. Some of those policies are working, some are not working, and we want some provide success story to people, okay, there is something working here, let us do it. So what I'm trying to say is if we have, in the longer term, if we can develop a system that help the countries, make a full report, not only the data side, this would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that last point for a reason, because I wanted to hear Adele's feedback. There was the question concerned the deployment and the regional deployment. We had an implementation plan that was hierarchical, and that as the co-developers, we installed our system in EUD, we use it, we test it, we refine it, and then we would deploy it across the UAE as a national, as a relatively medium-sized country, manageable in terms of deployment and resolving issues, and then we would go global. Now what's interesting is that, and that strategy I think still applies, and when we work with the deployment team, obviously to provide our input from at the level of employment and the knowledge we know and we gain from about the region, and the regional context, to provide that regional context. But what's interesting is the success that the unexpected success and the pickup that Erick's referenced. How so many different countries have shown interest, and also how it's been of interest to people in different domains. One of the unintended characteristics of the virus, by design, it's agnostic to any particular indicator, and therefore any particular application domain. And I know there have been interests and passing questions of, well, can I use it for something which has been wildly different? I mean, never within our scope, and certainly not something we would look to do per se, because it's spreading ourselves too thin. But it's exciting to hear that uptake is there, and it's really, I think, the UNEP's engagement of a private sector company who's got professional capabilities to deploy in a professional manner. So the answer is that yes, of course, we look forward to supporting a regional deployment, and I'm really happy to hear that the project has had the uptake, and that we can look forward to a professional deployment in the world.
Well, time is up. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions from the audience, but I will invite bilateral discussions with the presenters. I thank very much the presenters, particularly again. We are strongly committed, UN Environment, EAD, to move these to the next stage, to the next level. And the next level is actually using it, the pace that they're putting in improving it. So basically we really are committed together with GD, with EAD, to move it to the regional and then global level. And this is the way to go. I'm pretty much sure having partnering with the private sector is very important, because it will allow us to assess and evaluate professionally as we move along. And that's it. And thank you very much for coming, and